actually use the thread that we posted on Piazza. Again, study groups help. We have specified the rules of what is allowed and what is not in the on Piazza. So, but it definitely helps to have other people bounce your ideas off, and learning communally is always a lot more helpful, a lot more educational than trying to learn stuff all by yourself, sitting in a corner, right? So anyway, let's begin. It's a very sparse class. I think we're less than 20 today. That means I have 300 people who should be watching the video. So here's where we were. Quick recap, right? We saw that to train a network, we define a loss function, which is the average of the divergences of several training instances. And we do this using gradient descent, which is to say you start off with some initial estimate and then keep walking against the gradient. In order to compute the gradient, you have to compute the average derivative of the divergence with respect to the parameters for over the training instances, and the derivative of the divergence for any given training instance is computed using Backprop. We saw that gradient descent, vanilla gradient descent, has problems, and the problem is that the loss is a function of many parameters, and the loss surface might have different eccentricities in different directions. So if you use your standard gradient descent rule, which has a fixed step size for every direction, then what is a good step size in one direction may be too slow in the other or too fast in the other, and so you might either never converge or just diverge. So we ended with looking at some derivative inspired algorithms where you try to untie the learning of components, algorithms which obtain separate updates for each dimension, and basically only use the derivative information for trends. Specifically, we saw RProp and QuickProp. We didn't see QuickProp in class, but I'm very sure you've all been very good students and you've looked at the slides, right? And now, we saw that this thing can be more effective than gradient descent, but it has the problem that it loses the relationship between dimensions. So for example, when you consider the x dimension and you go in, and the x dimension gives you a specific step size, and the y dimension independently gives you a different step size, when you combine the two, although each of them individually might be improving things, together they might not. And so you have this issue. So this problem still remains, and so that can cost you efficiency. So we saw momentum methods. Momentum methods try to average out the fluctuations in the gradient. So if you're walking along the steepest direction, then even if you had a very perfectly convex function, you might find that the gradients keep swinging back and forth. So if you maintain a running average, all the directions in which you have oscillation will kind of cancel out. The directions in which you have steady progress will support one another, and so you can expect to have much smoother convergence towards the gradient. The original paper on the gradient methods by Polyak is up on the website. I highly recommend that you actually read it because it's a very nice read. Then we saw an update on it, which was Nestorov's method, which is supposed to give you a convergence rate of 1 over k squared, where k is the number of iterations for convex functions. Again, this paper is up on the website, but I don't think you can read it. It's in Russian. Now, so then we saw incremental methods. Incremental methods where instead of considering all of the training instances at once, you sort of consider the training instances individually or in mini batches after randomization. We saw that randomization was important. Stochastic gradient descent updates parameters after each instant. Mini batch descent updates them after batches of instances. Both of them, so where we stopped, we saw that although both of them have potentially much faster convergence than batch descent, in terms of the number of iterations at least, the issue was because the size was much smaller for each batch. Specifically in the case of stochastic gradient, the size of your sample was 1, right? So the variance was much larger. What this meant was that your estimates could swing around a whole lot, because each time you pick a sample, the estimate, the loss function is going to be entirely different. We saw that's what the variance meant, right? And so we have to deal with this business of variance. So convergence for these incremental update rules and online rules really depends on the learning rate. And so a simple technique is, you want to have the converging learning rate, shrinking learning rate. We had other techniques where you could fix it till the error plateaued, then reduce it. Regardless of how you did it, you had the requirement that the learning rates should sum to infinity. And yet, if you raise the learning rate to some power, then they should be a finite sum. So that way it would converge, meaning the learning rates would shrink and you wouldn't keep chasing your tail all the time. On the other hand, you do have the possibility of exploring the entire space. But in all of these, you still have this one issue that it's kind of dependent on having the appropriate learning rate schedule. Otherwise, things are not going to converge, right? So this is where we start. Now, let's go back and look at momentum and momentum methods briefly. So remember, again, the last thing we said was that when you have these incremental update rules, the variance is too large, because your batches are different, and each time in fact, every time you make an update, you're making an update for a completely different loss function, because you're looking for at a completely different set of samples. And what we meant by variance in these cases was that, across sample draws, the loss functions and the recommended updates could be completely different. And that really is what is going to happen in these cases, right? So how would momentum methods help? Now remember, what does momentum do? Momentum updates using a running average of the gradient. So it just maintains a running average of the gradient. And what happens when you maintain a running average? Oscillations tend to get smoothed out. Directions tend to get supported. What would happen to the variance? The variance is going to reduce because it's going to get rid of swinging, right? And so, particularly in the case of incremental methods like stochastic gradient descent and mini batch, having momentum methods and momentum-like methods could actually be critical to getting decent estimates, because they clean up the variance. In the case of the standard Polyak momentum method, you're just going to have a running average of your gradient. So the step size is going to be some scaled version of the past step size plus the current step, which is against the current gradient. And your update is going to be based on this running average. So this is just the pseudocode for it. Again, you'd be going over each batch, compute the average derivative, and then compute your new update and take a step. But the point here is that you're doing this after every batch, not after going over the entire training data. So you're going to be updating your step and computing your running average after every mini batch and taking a step. The same thing with Nestorov's method. Nestorov's method we saw was superior to the standard momentum method because it computed the gradient at the correct spot. It first took the extended step and then adjusted for the gradient. So this is going to be provably faster, as you will find in that Russian paper on the web. And so the math is readable. The math is in a very common language. It's in Greek. But this too applies to incremental methods. In all cases, so here was the Nestorov's accelerated gradient. You compute the derivative at the new spot and then add that to your to the running average of the step, right? And the pseudocode. I'll skip this. But in all cases, the momentum methods have this nice property that by maintaining running averages of different kinds, they will shrink the variance of your estimated gradients, and that means that the wild swinging is going to go down, right? But then here's what happens when I maintain a running average? What am I smoothing out? I'm actually considering only the first moment of the derivatives, right? there's more to the distribution of the derivatives than just the first moment. So what is happening when I do my momentum methods is that I'm keeping track of the derivatives across time, the gradients, and computing the expected value of the derivative at the next step, which is to say the expectation will smooth out these fluctuations, and then you're taking a step along the expected value. But is that sufficient? Because I might have an expected value of 0, but the variance might be very large. Or I might have an expected value of 0 where the variance is almost 0, right? Now in the first case, you're obviously not going to trust even the expected value very much, because there's so much variation that you really should have considered, whereas in the second case you really would trust it. So then the higher order methods actually, the newer methods actually also take into consideration the variance of the derivatives. So to give you an example, consider this little plot. This is again from, I think, Sebastian Ruder's webpage. So I have all of these steps. I took a little scale and measured the step sizes and rounded them in the vertical and the horizontal directions. So this first guy has a step size of 1 in the horizontal direction and plus 2.5 in the vertical direction. The second one has a step of 1 in the horizontal direction and minus 3.5 in the vertical direction. The third one is 3 in the horizontal direction and 2.5 in the vertical. Then the fourth one is 1 in the horizontal, minus 2. You can see what's happening. In the horizontal direction, the steps are always 0, positive, right? In the vertical direction, they are swinging up and down. What do we observe about this? This is actually after applying momentum. So this is not just vanilla gradient descent, right? So what is happening that even after I begin tracking the running estimates, right? In this case, am I applying momentum? Not here maybe. But even more generally, even when I'm tracking the running estimates, what you will find is these swings around, right? So we saw this when I was trying to draw an example in the class yesterday. You know, even with momentum, the first time I may do this, the next time I may do this, but because I've canceled things out, the next update I go swinging wildly down, right? So you're going to have this variation. So the second moment of the corrections gives you some information. Now what we have done so far in the momentum methods is that we have maintained a running average of all of these steps, but there was still a magic parameter, which was the learning rate, right? We will now account for this second moment of the derivatives by adjusting the learning rate over the iterations. So there are a number of, you want to dampen the step size in directions where you have high variance. You want to increase the step size in directions where you have low variance. And so here is the overall general high-level approach, normalizing steps by the second moment. If in the recent past the total movement in the y component is high, right, the total movement is going to be high because you're swinging around, and yet the net movement would actually be small, right? So if the net movement is small and the total movement is high, you want to shrink that step size. If the net movement is large and the total movement is large, you want to increase the step size, right? So that's what we're going to do. You're going to modify the usual gradient-based update, but you're going to decrease the step size over here in the y component. You're going to scale up the step size in the horizontal component, and we are going to do this according to their variation, not just the average. How much have I moved in terms of distance covered? How much have I moved in terms of the vector distance covered? The discrepancy between the two is going to tell you how good I am in getting towards the optimum, right? Makes sense? So several methods based on this. The simplest one is RMSprop. RMSprop was proposed by Hinton. I don't believe they actually ever published a formal article on it, but it's very popular. So you maintain here is some notation. So when I use this partial subscript w, that represents the derivative with respect to w. And when I say the partial second partial dou square w, that actually is the this is not the second derivative, this is the square of the derivative, just to give you an idea of the notation I'm using. I need some shorthand. So this is bad shorthand, but just keep this in mind, right? And so when I write an expectation, I'm just going to put an E outside, which is the expected value. So in this case, it's the expected value of the squared derivative, okay? And here's how this algorithm works. You're going to maintain a running estimate of the mean squared value of the derivative. So you've got this derivative over here, and so this guy, this k minus 1 was the mean squared derivative at the previous step. I'm going to add in some fraction of the squared derivative at the current step. The overall is going to give me a running average of the squared derivative, right? This is the second moment of the derivative. And now look what's happening. You're just using your standard gradient descent rule. You're not even doing momentum over here. You're not using the first moment at all. You're using only the second moment. And you're normalizing the learning rate by the RMS value, the square root of the second moment. So this will now consider what happens over here. If I always have the same derivative over a long period of time, then the RMS value and the actual derivative value will end up having the same value. When I take the ratio, the magnitudes will get cancelled out. Only the sign will remain. That looks like RProp, right? That's why they call it RMSprop. So here is the pseudocode for RMSprop. We'll see how this works in a little bit. RMSprop, you can see they're just maintaining a running average of the second moment, and then the step size itself divides by the square root of the second moment, right? Now, what is the issue over here? This is considering the second moment. What's it missing? It's missing the first moment, right? Momentum methods consider the first moment. RMSprop is considering the second moment. Maybe you want to consider both, right? Make sense? And so that is this technique called ADAM, which all of us have been using in our optimizers, right? And here's what ADAM does. You actually first maintain your first moment. So now you're not going to be just using the raw gradient. You'll be using the expected value of the gradient. At the same time, you're going to be dividing by the square root of the second moment. So it's combining moment and first and second moments. It makes sense to you? You guys have been using this. If you wondered why we do what we do, this is the answer, right? Now there is a little bit of a magical term over here, which is this divided by 1 over 1 minus delta to the k. And there's a reason for this. Typically, the delta values are very close to 1. Now, when you initialize everything, this mk minus 1 and vk minus 1 are going to be 0, which means that your updated value, because 1 minus delta will be very close to 0, if delta is close to 1, you're going to be very slow to update your means and variances, right? The first and second moments. So in order to avoid that, you have this extra term over here, which says in the early iterations, don't give too much importance to the 1 minus delta. But then as the iterations progress, delta raised to k or gamma raised to k are going to become large values, and they will going to become 0, and so the denominator will go away, and this becomes exactly what you want, right? Without the correction, it's not going to work because it's going to be very slow in the beginning. Now, so there are many other variants of the same theme. So you get the general idea of what we are talking about, what momentum was, what RMSprop was, and what ADAM was. And once you think about things this way, then you can possibly come up with other ideas along the same line on your own. And sure enough, people have come up with many, many ideas. You have ADA delta, ADA grad, ADA max, you name it. And so Alex Radford has these very nice animations on his web page for how these different techniques work. And if you actually look at the techniques, consider the techniques, and if you think about how the function behaves, then you will actually understand why these trajectories are as they are. This is the so-called Beale's function, and the minimum is actually out here. All of the slices, the lines, are level set contours, right? And you can see he doesn't have Adam over here, but he has several different techniques that he's trying. Stochastic gradient descent takes its time, right? Momentum sort of begins swinging around and then eventually gets there, but Nestorov's is much faster, as you can see. Nestorov's is still momentum, but it's an optimal version of momentum, right? And then add a grad, add a delta. RMSprop forgets about the first order term. It only considers the second moment. So if you look at RMSprop is probably going to begin slowing down once it gets the optimum, because it's not really maintaining your running average of the momentum. It's only looking at the current derivative, which is very small near the momentum, and it's going to slow down, right? And you can similarly see how the other things behave. So here, again, you will see something interesting. What do we know about RMSprop when the slope is constant? You have the derivative divided by the RMS value of the derivative. When the slope is constant, the two are the same. All that remains is a sign. The steps become fixed, right? So if you have a steady slope, it's just going to take its time, right? You want methods which automatically sort of account for this, right? And so if you consider what happens with the different methods over here, you will find that in this case, stochastic gradient descent is partying out there. It's never going to leave. But the rest of them, you can see, eventually sort of break off. Momentum gets stuck there, but Nestorov's breaks off and then really rushes off. You can see exactly what happens. When you have these bowls with lots of variation, then second order methods which account for them are going to be better. But in one objective function at different locations, you may have bowls, and at other locations you might have nice plane surfaces. And the local behavior is going to depend on the nature of the error surface itself and where the gradients point, right? So it's very hard for us to say which one is going to be optimal, because we really don't know what this loss function looks like at any point. But if you gave me a specific loss function of a specific kind, I could sort of visualize it and tell you which one to use, right? Because we know how these different techniques behave. Here's a different one, right? So once again, stochastic gradient descent. Stochastic gradient descent likes to, it hangs around in flat spaces, but you need other methods to get out of those. So here's the story so far. Gradient descent can be sped up by incremental updates. Convergence is guaranteed under most conditions, but the learning rate must shrink. Convergence can be so also with mini batch, right? This can be more efficient than SGD. Convergence can be improved using smoothed updates like RMSprop and other advanced techniques, right? Questions on Piazza? Now, can you put the form? Yes. So here's the point. There's a difference between the variance you get due to randomly sampling your data differently and the variance you get as a natural, over the entire batch, right? So when you want to jump into a different location, when your loss function itself is changing from iteration to iteration, you really don't know where you're jumping. So there's a lack of knowledge of what you're doing, right? Variance is not always a good thing. Mostly it's not. Right? You need to have a certain degree of assurance that you're going to get to the right spot over the entire training data. Yeah. Yes, guys. Let me move this out of the way so you can all see it. So that is your web link for signing up for today. And I think today we have like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, about 40 people in class. So 60 in the last class, 80 the class before. It's not converging, it's linear, right? In two. 20 in the next 0. There'll be an empty class 2 weeks from now, and then I'll be bringing in people from the street. Be here. This is just not okay. Yes, just fun.
But when we use these techniques that regularize the step based on the second moment, do we still decrease the learning rate as we go ahead?
So here is what happens. The thing about this is now the learning rate adjusts. So I should have somewhere here, I have these values over here, right? So in these cases, with the second moment techniques, you really don't need to be adjusting your learning rates. You get rid of, because the second moment is being used to adjust the learning rate. So this business of trying to figure out what an optimal learning rate is and what kind of schedule you must use goes away, but it's replaced with other hyperparameters. And the hyperparameters you're going to use now are the hyperparameters related to the initial step size, where you begin from, and the hyperparameters related to how you maintain running averages. If your running averages are badly maintained, then, or for example, if the function is oscillating wildly, your running average could actually be a completely wrong estimate. If your function is smooth, and if your running average parameters are assuming that things change fast, then you're going to be suboptimal. So you have these other things to worry about. You can never escape. There's no such thing as a free lunch. So here are some standard parameters that we use for RMSprop and Adam, right? So, yes.
In the Adam slide, the delta and gamma were like delta k, gamma p. Are we changing those as well?
Which one, delta k? No, that's delta raised to k.
Oh, that's the power.
Yeah, right. That's so that when at the first iteration you get 1 minus delta, it cancels out, right? So this makes sure that you don't, in the beginning, you're not very slow, right? So if you've all signed up over here, tiny URL. Today we have a much more decent number, much more decent URL, which is 11785-S20-roll call 763. Okay, I'm going to erase this in about 5 minutes, and we'll continue. So those of you who are watching the video, this is your cue. Right. Here's where you are. Anyway. Let me continue. So we're going to look at other things like generalization and tricks of the trade. So I'm running behind time a little bit. First, what are the things we can do to make the whole thing behave nicer? You can worry about the divergence. You can worry about all kinds of normalizations. We'll be going over most of these, and the stuff that I don't manage to go over in the class, I expect you to go over the slides, and we'll very conveniently have a quiz that focuses on the things that I skipped in class. So once again, here's how we defined our loss function. Our loss function was the average divergence over all of the training samples. So we are trying to minimize the loss, and the way we minimize it is we walk down the derivatives, the gradients of the divergence function, which means that our ability to minimize this function really depends on the nature of the divergence function, right? So if your divergence function has this beautiful shape out here, you're not going to have any luck doing anything useful with it, because there are just millions and millions of little local optima, local minima, and the entire shape is kind of ugly, right? Now, if the divergence function is like this, it has a nice little local minimum, and it's a very steep local minimum. It's a horrible divergence function. And why would that be? Because the slopes far away from the minimum are very low, and typically when we walk, what happens? We walk slowly where the slope is flat because we are expecting to encounter minimum, and you walk fast when the slope is steep. So this guy is going to take forever to come here and then just get lost, right? The ideal shape for the divergence function is going to be like this, which is a nice bowl where far away from the minimum it's steep, and close to the minimum it's kind of shallow, but not too shallow, right? So here are the desiderata for a good divergence. If you have something like this, this is not good. You're going to take lots of tiny steps initially, And then when you get near the minimum, you're going to begin jumping around and maybe just get out of the valley altogether. This is a much nicer function, right? And so we have to worry about the nature of the divergence itself, okay? But the divergence depends on the, and the ideal divergence, it turns out that, you can get bowl shapes for all kinds of functions, but then there's also the other thing. If I, for example, consider x raised to 4 or x raised to 100, x raised to 100 has a minimum at 0, but it's almost flat when you come close to 0. You are never actually going to get to the minimum using gradient descent because it's so flat. So it turns out almost pretty much the best case that you can get for a bowl, which actually ensures you get to the minimum in the fastest you can, is a quadratic. If it gets steeper than a quadratic far away, you have, and flat, if it gets more bowly than a quadratic, then it's going to become too flat near the minimum. If it's less so, then you're going to get the first case, which is not a good thing, right? So now, the divergence function depends on the activation, right? Because you have some parameters, the parameters combined with some inputs, they go through the activation, and then the output of the activation actually goes into the computation of the divergence function. We've discussed different divergence functions. One of them was the L2 divergence function, the other was the KL divergence function, right? Now remember, what is the L2 divergence function? It's a quadratic, right? The KL was, we don't really know what it was like. So of these two, which of the two, KL and L2, is more likely to look like this bowl? L2, right? How many of you think it's going to be L2? Right? Okay, all of you are wrong, right? So now, and we'll see why. So again, this is the L2 divergence over multiple outputs, single output. This is the KL divergence over multiple outputs. This is over a single output. The Kullback-Leibler divergence is the same as the cross entropy with an extra term, which doesn't matter. So now consider a single perceptron, right? So let's skip this. Let's get to the pictures. Pictures are fun. Consider a single perceptron. Let's consider a perceptron with only 2 inputs and no bias for convenience, right? And so I give you a bunch of training samples. I compute the output for the perceptron, and then where I actually, in this case, not a perceptron, but more like a logistic function. And then I compute the divergence with respect of the output of the logistic function with respect to the target outputs. Now what are the parameters? The parameters are the 2 weights of the logistic function, because the logistic function has only 2. In my example, I have only 2 dimensions, right? 2 inputs. And here is a plot of how the loss varies as I change the parameters, these 2 weights. The left one is the L2. The one to the right is the KL. Right? Which of these is nicer according to the definition we had earlier? The KL is the bowl, right? The L2 actually looks like a flower. This is exactly what we didn't want back here. So if you wonder why we are not using KL and why we are using L2 when we are training classifiers, it's not the shape with respect to the output of the classifier, is the shape of the loss function with respect to the parameters of the classifier. And when you think of the shape of the loss function with respect to the parameters of the classifier, the KL divergence gives you a nice bowl. It's actually convex. In the case of the L2, it's not even convex, although it does have a unique minimum at the same spot, right? Which is why we don't use the first, we use the second. Right. Manuel, you're looking puzzled? So the shape of the loss function is going to vary based on the shape is going to be more or less the same. The details are going to vary based on the training instances, right? And what you will find is that the L2 actually has this flower shape and the KL has the bowl shape. Okay, yes?
So in this slide, you only gave a single perceptron example. So
Yeah.
how far like a deep undergrad.
So as you get deeper, the whole thing gets more ugly, right? But if you start off simply because you have all of these non-linearities going in, I mean, we've been saying all along that we really don't know what the loss function looks like. But if you just stop at just what happens in the layer just before the perceptron output layer, at that location itself, the KL is worse than the L2 is worse than your KL. You can only expect that things are going to get much worse as you go through the network.
Why will we expect this trend will increase instead of decrease?
So again, at this point, this is more of an intuition. I'm not presenting you with math, but for any given, at any given point, if I think of a bunch of target outputs, so you can imagine having target outputs at the output of the penultimate layer, right? So those are going to be, based on that, you're going to have a loss function for the weight functions in the layer underneath. So one would expect, again, I'm hand waving over here, that whatever shape you have over here is going to get transformed as you keep going through the layers. And intuitively, the shape is going to get, since you begin with something that's already not convex, it can't get more convex, right? As you add, especially if you're using things like ReLUs, which are mostly linear transforms, then you can see why this would hold. Again, don't take my word for it. You can check out the papers, right? We'll put some links on the web. So the point is, observe that L2 is not convex, KL is convex, although L2 and KL have unique global minima at the same point. So now, while at it, this is just a side term. The term backpropagation actually comes from error backpropagation. That was the original name given to the algorithm. And the reason we call it error backpropagation is that when you compute the derivative of the L2 divergence with respect to y, that's just going to be the error itself, right? It's y minus d whole squared. You take the derivative, which is going to give you y minus d. So, and that's what kept getting backpropagated. So we call it error backpropagation. Anyway, going on, gradient descent can be sped up by incremental updates. Convergence can be improved by using smoothed updates. The choice of divergence affects the learned network and the results. So you lady at the back, that's the website you have to go to URL you have to go to sign up for today, and I'm going to erase that in about 5 minutes. So now here's another problem. All of you have been dealing with batch norm, right? Batch norm has to do with covariate shifts. So when you work with mini batches, what is the assumption you're making? The assumption you're making is that every mini batch has more or less the same statistics as every other mini batch, so that if I minimize for one mini batch, I'm going to get the minimum for the close to the minimum for the other mini batch, and that over all the mini batches, I get the correct solution. So this is going to be the assumption. If each colored patch represents a different mini batch, this is the kind of scatter that you're going to assume, that you have that you assume implicitly. The reality of it is that they're not going to look like this. They're going to be all different. And the actual reality of it is that they're going to be very different, right? So if I have things this far apart, minimizing things for any one mini batch is not going to tell you anything about what happens with the other mini batches, right? So what you really want to do is to move all of these batches to some standard location. Now the problem is that if you go back here, over the entire training data, any given neuron, any given parameter lives in a specific region of the space, right? Maybe here. So if I move all of my mini batches to a standard location, they're not going to be representative of the region of the space where I want that neuron to survive. So here's what we will do. We are going to start off by moving all of the mini batches to a standard location, zero mean and unit variance. And then we're going to move the entire pile to the location where we think they must be, where we believe that the statistics would have lived if you had considered all the data all at once, right? The universal statistic. And so how would we do this? So you see what's happening over here, right? The covariate shift. So how would we do this? This is a covariate adjustment that happens after the weighted addition of the inputs. So basically this typically is applied at the location of the affine combinations. So you could do it after the activations, but typically we will do it just before the activations, and there's a reason for this. If somebody posts on Piazza, we can talk about it. There are lots and lots of explanations on the web about this. But for now, let's just live with the fact that we're going to apply it here, and what we are going to do, and the purpose of the covariate shift must be obvious from the pictures that we just saw, right? Now, the purpose of the batch norm, which is to cancel out the covariate shifts. The actual process has 2 steps. So the first step is this guy, where you take the entire mini batch and move it to the 0 position. And then the second step is this guy, where you move the entire mini batch to the correct position, which is to be determined, right? So if you look at the equations, you have over each mini batch and over each sample of each mini batch, you have all of these steps. First, you would be computing the mean of the mini batch, where the mean of the mini batch is the average over the mini batch. You would be computing the variance of the mini batch, which is also the average over the mini batch. So the mean and the variance obviously go into normalizing the instances in the mini batch. Then the second step, you would normalize every instance in the mini batch by subtracting the mean and dividing by the standard deviation. So what this means is that the mini batch, as a result, has a mean of 0 and a variance of 1. So you've standardized every mini batch. So that's what this first block does. But then, having standardized all of these, you move them to the correct location, which is given by this operator here, where you now scale it so that it has the right size, and then add some constant so that you shift it to the correct position, right? So this is what is happening when you actually perform batch normalization. And this is during training, right? So for every mini batch, we're doing this. So this shift is going to be unit specific. This is by neuron, right? This is what is happening for every neuron, because each neuron lives in a different, the parameters for each neuron live in a specific location of the space. So I can draw the entire figure like so. The second block, I don't need to sort of draw a little unknown blue square. The operation is very clear. I'm going to be multiplying by this u, which is the normalized version of the instances for the mini batch, by some gamma, and then I'm going to be adding some shift, the standard shift, which is the beta, right? So this little operation sort of fouls up how we compute derivatives for backpropagation. And the reason for this is as follows. In conventional learning, we try to compute the derivative of the divergence with respect to the individual training instances. Here, so you compute the average divergence over the mini batch, and then when I take the derivative, it's the average derivative of the individual instances, where I can compute the derivative for any individual instance independently of every other guy, right? The moment I begin considering batch normalization, that goes away, because this output is now a function of not just this current input in the mini batch, but the mean of the mini batch and the variance of the mini batch. And the mean and the variance involve every other instance in the mini batch, right? So that means this becomes a lot more complicated than you would actually have thought. The actual dependence is like this. Again, here what I'm showing is these are all not the dimensions of the input. I have B instances in the mini batch, so each line actually represents one training instance in the mini batch. This is what is happening at one node in the network, right? So I have B instances in the mini batch. Every one of these instances is being normalized to give you, I have each of these z's is being normalized to give you a z hat. But then each z hat depends not only on the corresponding z, but every other z in the mini batch, right? So when I compute the derivative of the divergence with respect to this guy, I have to compute the derivative of the divergence with respect to all of these guys and the derivative of these guys with respect to z. Now you have to think of the derivative as being computed globally over this entire mini batch, and you cannot be thinking of derivatives being computed locally for every instance in the mini batch, simply because they all interact, right? So if you actually wanted to draw the diagram, this is what the diagram is going to look like. All of the instances contribute to the mean. All of the instances and the mean contribute to the variance. And then each instance and the mean and the variance influence the corresponding output. And if you've been through this business of the influence diagrams in our home in the latest quiz and the note that I posted, this figure should be enough for you to write down all of the derivatives. You should be able to work things out, right? Now, nevertheless, I will actually go through this exercise just to give you an idea of where these things come from. The actual figure, this figure is incomplete, right? Looks like this. The z, which is the pre-normalized, affine combination, influences the mean. Every z in the mini batch influences the mean. I'm not showing you that. The z influences the variance, right? The mean and the variance influence the normalized u, and then the normalized u is what is being used to compute the divergence. Right? Then that is shifted, and that's being used to compute the divergence. But then this divergence, this mean and variance influence every other instance in the mini batch as well, and those two affect the divergence, right? That's what the dotted lines show. So let's see how the entire backpropagation works. Okay, so initially you're going to have the derivative of the divergence with respect to y. Once you have the derivative of the divergence with respect to y, you can go beyond, the activation is applied to the normalized and shifted z. So the activation f is applied to z hat. You can take the derivative with respect to y and move it back, and backpropagation is going to give you the derivative with respect to z hat. This we know how to do. This is very trivial, right? The real complexity happens in going from here to here, and remember, for each neuron now there are two parameters, the gamma and the beta, right? We also have to find out how to compute derivatives with respect to these guys. So now, yes. I don't need to erase it, I can cover it. And does somebody see chalk? In case I forget, it's right in the middle, okay? So let's say I have the derivative with respect to, yes? So we'll get to that, but the point is these mean and variance are mini batch specific during the forward pass, during the training, right? Yeah, so, and the running mean is separate. I haven't yet gotten to it, right? Okay. So there are problems with that. Just doing this mini batch, this covariate adjustment causes grief in other ways, and we'll get to it, right? But let's first try to compute this derivative. Now, it's very easy for me. I have z hat. What is this doing here? Okay. I have z hat equals some gamma times u plus beta, right? Now I have the derivative with respect to z hat. This is given to me, right? And during the forward pass, I've computed the u, which is the normalized zero mean unit variance u, right? So I already have the u. So what is the derivative of the divergence with respect to beta? What would this be? This is simply going to be the derivative of the divergence with respect to z hat times the derivative of z hat with respect to beta, right? And what is the derivative of z hat with respect to beta? It's 1. You can check it. So guy at the back, can you turn your phone off? No phones in this room. Okay. So if you're here, you're attending class. If you want to look up your phone, go outside, finish your phone business, then come back in. Okay? Right. So what is this thing? What's the derivative of z hat with respect to beta? 1. So this is easy. That's just this guy, right? Now what about the derivative with respect to gamma? That's going to be the derivative of z hat with respect to gamma. And what is that? That is u, right? So I can just easy enough. This is u. And so I know how to compute the derivatives with respect to these two parameters. Trivial. But then I have to keep back propagating. What do I need? The derivative with respect to u. And what would the derivative with respect to u be? That's going to be the derivative. What would the derivative with respect to u be over here? It's going to be multiplied by the derivative of z hat with respect to u, and that would just be gamma, right? So easy. So going all the way back to this location is very trivial. We know exactly how to do this. The real tedium is in taking that derivative with respect to u all the way back to the unnormalized z, and that's where the entire world kicked in, right? So we want to take this all the way back there, and here is the complete set of relations. Now remember that little box I drew where I've showed you everything coming in and everything going out. You could just work your way through that box, right? Use the influence diagram arithmetic. You would end up with the correct answer. You don't need the following slides. But I'm doing this because I made the slides. So I have a reason to show it to you. Now here's what it is. Z hat is u is a function of three things. It's a function of z, it's a function of the mean, and it's a function of the variance, right? So if I go back, you have the partial derivative of divergence with respect to z is going to be the derivative of the divergence with respect to u times the derivative of u with respect to z plus the derivative of the divergence with respect to the variance times the derivative of the divergence variance with respect to z plus the derivative of the divergence with respect to the mean times the derivative of the mean with respect to z, right? If I draw the figure, the divergence goes to z, the relation between these two goes, here are these paths. There's this path, right? Then there's this path, and then there is this path. So those three have to be accounted for. These figures are very nice to see exactly everything that you have to account for. Now let's consider the variance first, right? The variance influences the divergence, but the variance influences the divergence not just through the current instance in the batch. It influences it through every instance in the batch, right? So the derivative of the divergence with respect to the variance, you'd have to sum over all of the instances in the batch. And then you got you're going to be summing over I, derivative of the divergence with respect to ui times the derivative of ui with respect to sigma squared, correct? But the derivative of sigma squared, u with respect to sigma squared, can be found from this equation over here. what will it be? It's 1 over square root of sigma squared, right? Sigma squared plus epsilon. So what is the derivative of u over d sigma squared? That's going to be, the z minus mu doesn't matter. This is not a function of sigma squared, right? And then you have sigma squared raised to minus half, right? So when you multiply that, it's going to be minus half times sigma squared plus epsilon raised to minus 3 over 2, right? And so there is what you're going to get. That's the derivative of the divergence with respect to sigma squared. Very trivial. What about this guy? The derivative of the divergence of the variance with respect to zi. Now observe that the variance is related to zi through two paths. I've only highlighted one. What have I missed? The path that goes through the mean, right? I have missed it. And the reason I have missed it is I didn't want to waste your time showing something that doesn't matter, but I will show it to you again when we begin talking about the derivative with respect to the mean. It turns out that the derivative along this path becomes 0. So the only path you have to consider is this one, and this is easy. You have the variance is going to be 1 over b summation sigma z minus mu squared, right? And so for any particular zi, all this 1 over b remains for any particular, that's just a multiplicative constant. The derivative with all the other z's, the derivative of all the terms that don't involve zi is 0. And for the specific term that does involve zi, the derivative of this guy with respect to zi is going to be simply zi minus mu, right? So we have sort of computed this term, right? So now let's look at this one. This one is a little more tedious, right? Look at how the divergence relates to the mean. It relates to the mean in two ways. It has all of these paths which go only through u, but then it also has all of these paths which also go through sigma, right? You have to account for both sets of connections. So if I want to compute this, let's consider the paths through u. U is z minus mu over square root of sigma squared, right? So what is the derivative of the divergence with respect to mu when I consider this? It's the derivative of the divergence with respect to u times the derivative of u with respect to mu, which is simply going to be, because it's a minus mu, you get the minus sign and the denominator just remains, right? So this is going to be sum over all the instances of the derivative of the divergence with respect to u times 1 over sigma squared. This is very easy. What about the second term? This second term is the derivative that goes through sigma. I've just written it out. If you can just work it out from here, it's the derivative of divergence with respect to sigma times the derivative of sigma squared with respect to mu. But then if you take this, all that happens is that because mu is constant for all of these guys, the summation remains, the 2 comes out. It's a minus mu, so minus comes out. The division by b remains. What is this term? This term, I'm summing all the z's and subtracting the mean. That's going to be 0, right? It's for the same reason. That's the reason I didn't show that out here. It's the same term out here. That goes out to 0. So that actually goes away, and all that remains when you think of the derivative with respect to the mean, right? And the derivative of the mean with respect to z, of course, we know exactly how to compute the z. The mean is just 1 over b. We didn't look at this first term, the derivative of divergence with respect to u times the derivative of u with respect to z, again from this guy, that's just going to be 1 over the square root of the standard variance, right? And so when all is said and done, you have this very simple formula which looks a lot uglier than it is. But if you draw the pictures and work your way through it, you can see exactly where everything comes from. That's the reason I've introduced this whole notion of drawing these figures when we went through the homework and the previous notes, right? They really simplify the process of thinking your way through these things. You didn't have to do this. You could have gone through the earlier figure where you just saw this vector operation across all of the inputs and all of the outputs. you would have ended up with exactly the same solutions, right? And so once you've computed the derivative of the divergence with respect to z, you just keep going on. Batch norm just continues from there. The backprop just continues from there. Now, on test data, where are the mu and the sigma? You have none, right? Your test instances come in one at a time. If your test instances came in as a batch, then technically you could compute the mean and the variance for the batch and then just perform the same operation, and you would expect that to work, right? Because you're going to do the covariate shift for the batch of test instances. And for that, you want to be canceling out the covariate values for the batch of test instances. But your test instances don't come in as a batch of nicely behaved things, right? They generally come in one at a time. So you have to take a guess as to where this group of data that this test instance came from might have lived. And that you get from maintaining a running average of the mean and the variance over all of the batches. And specifically for the variance, we will use the unbiased estimator over here, where you divide by b minus 1. The number of batches are by b minus 1, right, rather than b. But you get the idea. So that's where the running estimate came from. And that's how what happens on the test instance differs from what happens on the training data. And so now, batch normalization is not a must. You don't need to apply it everywhere. You can apply it for some neurons. You can apply it for the entire layer. You can apply it for some layers. You can apply it to all the layers. You can apply it at the input to the activations. You could also apply it at the output to the activations. It doesn't really matter, right? So do you mind turning your phone off? The rule applies. I don't care if you put it on the table, hang it behind your neck, sit on it. If you want to turn it on, leave the room. Okay? Now, some things. You really don't want to be scolded by me. It's humiliating, so don't do it again. Now, batch normalization improves convergence rate and neural network performance. And there's anecdotal evidence that if you use batch norm, then you don't really want to be using dropout. But because one of the things that batch norm does is that within each batch for each neuron, it moves the data to where the activation, if you're using a sigmoid, it moves the data to where the activation is most linear because you're moving it to the 0 position, right? Which means you can now increase your learning rates and learn faster. You're in a good region. So if you're using ReLUs, there's a different, using 0 as your standard mean is probably not a very good idea because half your data is going to end up in the 0 region where there is no derivative. So yeah.
During training, why don't they just use the running averages as beta and gamma?
So during training, you want to know that. So you have all of these guys which are all over the place. You could, but it's better off actually trying to learn where the whole thing could be, right? Maybe it's worth a try. But having a few more parameters to be a little more precise helps. Also, one of the things that happens is that if you're using the running averages, it keeps changing. It's nothing fixed, right? From batch to batch, yeah.
Since you have already shipped your data by gamma and beta, and then it won't always happen in a 0 position.
So no, this is after normalization, right? So when I see a new training instance, that's not come to this neuron yet. So it's still coming up from the bottom or top of the network, depending on which way you draw the network, right? So when you apply the activation, you're only considering what happened in the previous layers. So every time you come and get some batch, it's going to be in some place, not where you want it to be. Section? This is different. This is being applied differently for each neuron, right?
For each neuron?
Across the batch. Across the batch. You're absolutely right, right? And BN, for this to really work, you need better randomization of the training data. Otherwise, you can have all kinds of clumpy effects and strange stuff happening. Yes? So instead of doing batch normalization for every neuron in your network, you can decide that I'm only doing batch normalization for neurons 7, 8, and 4. Right? There's nothing. It's a process that applies to whichever subset that whichever portions of the network that you'd like to apply to. That's all. May or may not help. I'm just saying that these are possibilities, right? And some typical results, I'll skip this, but it turns out that doing batch normalization properly actually can greatly speed up training, greatly speed up training. Now, so the story so far, oh man, I'm way behind, so you're going to have to go over, I'm going to go over by 5 minutes, just live with me, right? The gradient descent can be sped up by incremental updates. The choice of divergence affects learned networks and results, and covariate shift can be handled by batch normalization. Now, you have this business of, there's another problem. In all the figures I've shown, I gave you these very nice illustrations of samples of data taken from some distribution. You're trying to fit a function, all fake, right? What really happens? Here's the picture I showed. This was a two-dimensional plot, and I had really dense training points, right? It looks so nice. You can fit a function. And then we are defining an error over all of these functions, and we are trying to minimize it. What can happen? You want to learn the blue function, you can end up learning the red function. There's nothing stopping you, right? So how do you prevent this? To understand this first, let's understand exactly how little data you have, right? Now consider that I have just a 100-dimensional input, which is very small, a very small number of dimensions. Your typical image is what, 700 dimensions, right? To simplify matters, I'm going to assume that each dimension, each value is binary. It's either 0 or 1. That means all of your inputs live on the corners of a 100-dimensional hypercube. How many such corners exist? 10 raised to 15, right? If you just work your way through this. Now, 10 raised to 30 actually. There are 10 raised to 30 corners, locations where data can exist, if I only have 100-dimensional binary data. Now, suppose I give you 1,000 trillion training instances. Nobody ever has seen 1,000 trillion training instances in the world to date, right? But suppose I just gave you 1,000 trillion training instances. How many of these corners is that training data really going to touch? Basically, how many corners are empty? It turns out 10 raised to 30 corners are empty. The fraction of the possible training, because 10, you're off by a factor of 1,000 trillion, even when I give you that many training instances. So let me put it in a different perspective. Suppose I sat you in a tiny spaceship in one of the corners where there was a training instance, and then I let you travel. And you're allowed to randomly travel, but only along the edges of this cube. The universe would end before you hit the next training instance. That's how little training data you're providing. This figure is nonsense, right? This is not what you're actually providing. So that should give you an idea of the enormity of the problem that you're actually looking at. If I scale it down to how much training data I'm providing per component, per dimension, I'm providing, if I scale it down logarithmically, it's like 1.00000001 training instances per dimension. And I'm giving you this one point and saying, find me a function. Does that even begin to make sense? It doesn't make sense, right? So we need additional constraints on what the function can look like to make sure that it fills in something reasonable, right? Now, one way to do it is through weight manipulation. Let's consider a sigmoidal network with sigmoidal activations. If I have training data of this kind, the function I would like to learn is something like the blue curve, right? But we know the neural network is a universal approximator. It can actually learn this purple curve. Now, is this what you really want to learn? No, that's rubbish, right? So why is it able to learn this purple curve? That's because the individual neurons in the network are capable of arbitrarily steep change of value, right? If I were using sigmoids, for instance, then all I need to do, again, you know this from your homework, if I scale up the weights, what happens? We did this in the quiz, right? What happens when you scale up the weights? The region in which it's kind of linear shrinks. The network, if the weights become infinity, this is going to become a step function. If I don't impose any restrictions on the weights, then the network is, every neuron is fully capable of learning steep functions of this kind, and eventually you can end up learning this function. Whereas what you want is that smooth guy, right? So how do you make sure that it learns the smooth guy and not this nasty function? You say the weights cannot become very large. Because if the weights become large, it can just learn the steep function, right? If I want to say the weights cannot become large, I want to constrain the weights W to be low, and this will force slower increase in the function and force smoother functions. And so how do I enforce the weights to be large, to not be large? Here's your standard loss, and this is how you would minimize your standard loss. Now I'm going to add a penalty. I'm going to say, to my loss, I'm going to add the length or the weight vectors as an extra term. If you increase the length of the weights vectors, my loss goes up, so you're encouraged to keep the weights small. And now you're going to be computing your derivative, your gradient descent with respect to this modified loss, and this term is your weight regularizer. All of you have already used it, right? If you wondered where it came from, this is where it comes from. And how does this change your update? It's very simple. It turns out that when you take the derivative of this term to the right with respect to the weights, the derivative is simply going to be the weight itself. And so to your standard derivative, you just add some lambda times the weight function, the weights matrix. It should really be the transpose. I have this, remember, it's always going to be a transpose. So I've got some, these guys should be transposes. Is it? No, that's correct. Okay. So this is because I've pre-transposed these. So you just add the current weight. Lambda is the regularizer, which tells you how important it is for you to keep the weights low. Now, if you know that your function is naturally steep, then you want lambda to be small. If you assume your function is smooth, you want lambda to be large, right? So in your standard gradient descent, all that happens is that your earlier you just had this delta wk, now you're going to have delta wk plus lambda times wk as your update. Now, there's another way in which you can actually impose smoothness, and this is through network structure. So MLPs are universal approximators. You can arbitrarily increase the size of the network and make it model more and more wiggly functions. We know this, right? But even for a given number of parameters, deeper functions are going to give you much smoother functions than the deeper networks will give you much smoother functions than shallow but wide networks. And that's because every layer of the function restricts, every layer of the network restricts the kind of functions that can be represented. If I have very few parameters in any given layer, it kind of restricts the options that I have in the kinds of functions that I learn, and the next layer is only going to be able to tweak what it already got. And so as you keep stacking them up, the network actually becomes, you get more and more constraints on the shape of the function, so to speak. And so it actually stays smooth. To give you an example, here are two examples of decision boundaries. Black is 0, white is 1. And we know how to handcraft networks for decision boundaries of this kind. We've seen this many times. So here's an example where we actually drew 1,000 training samples from each of these two. We use the optimal network, the correct network, where we know from handcrafting it what the architecture must be, but then we try to learn the parameters of the network. And when you do it, here is what the actual decision boundary it learns. It doesn't learn anything useful. It's complete garbage, right? So here's a different one. Here are two examples. Here we are trying to get this hexagonal bold shape. Here we are trying to get the outline of a bear as a decision boundary. So the output must be 1 inside and 1 outside and 0 inside, I think, in this case. In each case, we've used 660 neurons in our network. So here, this is 3 layers of 220 neurons. Here's what it learned. 4 layers of 115, here's what it learned. 6 layers of 110, 4 layers of 165, I think, here's what it learned. 6 layers of 110, here's what it learned. 11 layers of 60, here's what it learned. So you can see that as I keep making the layers narrower and the network deeper, it's learning the shape better and better and better. And this is because just making the thing in networks deep rather than wide has a natural property of restricting the shapes it can model and gives you nice smoother functions. So there have been other kinds of methods proposed: L1 regularization of network activations, regularization with added noise, and possibly the most popular one, which is dropout, which I really should be covering, but since we have only 4 minutes left in class, you're going to go through from slides 102 through 135 on your own, and we'll make sure that you do. Questions? Questions on Piazza?